Well, hello, everyone, and welcome to the Art, Money, Success podcast. My name is Maria Brophy, and I am your host. And today we're going to talk about receiving criticism. Now, it's all over the world out there. When you put your art out there, your music, your videos, any of your content, you are absolutely opening yourself up to criticism. And this is why a lot of artists hesitate to show their art online. But look, if you're not sharing your content, your works of art with the world, then no one's going to be impacted by it. And for many of you, impact is really important to you. So I want to talk about receiving criticism, and I want to talk about the fear of criticism and how it stops us. I'm going to talk about how I've received a lot of criticism over the years, and so has my husband, Drew, and how hurtful it can be, but how we don't let it stop us. And I'm going to give you some tips on how to deal with it and get past it. So, first of all, I want you to know that your greatest work will be criticized. Just the way it is. No matter what you create, my husband Drew always says, someone's going to love it and someone's going to hate it. And if you want to create your best work, you have to create, create, create. You have to be able to not just welcome the pats on the back, but also withstand the criticism. You have to be strong about it. So my husband, Drew, back in the 90s, he created a new way to paint surfboards. Now, back in those days, surfboards are either white or they were airbrushed. Nothing crazy was ever painted on them. And the artist never put their name on their surfboard painting. Well, Drew Brophy came around in the 90s and he shook all that up when he started painting with Posca paint pens. Oh boy, that was scandalous back then because that was not the way surfboards were supposed to be painted. And in the surfing world, people are a little slow to change. So he received harsh criticism. As a matter of fact, one of his jobs painting surfboards in South Carolina, the guy who had hired him, he saw one of Drew's surfboard paintings where Drew painted it in the way that Drew wanted to paint it with the medium he wanted to paint it. And this guy, Kelly Richards, said, Drew, that is the ugliest painting I've ever seen, quote unquote. Now, we laugh about this now, 30 something years later. And Drew is still good friends with the guy who said that to him. And it is something we laugh about. But at the time, that really hurt his feelings and it really bummed him out. And for a second or two, he thought to himself, well, I'm not going to do that again. But luckily for us, Drew is incredibly stubborn. And he knew that he was onto something. And so he didn't let the criticism stop him. And he kept going with this new way of painting surfboards. He kept signing his name. And after a few years, he actually became known worldwide as the guy who changed the way surfboards were painted. And he's still known for that today. So know that when you are doing something new, something different, something that's going to impact the world in a tiny way, like surfboard painting, or in a giant way, you are going to be criticized. And here's my thought on criticism, okay? Usually when someone's criticizing you, it's one of two things. Number one, they know more than you and they know you can do better. And if that's where the criticism is coming from, then the criticism is a gift to you. Because if you listen, then you will do better. So it's not harming you, it's pushing you to be the best version of yourself. And so you can learn from it. Now, the second place that criticism comes from is what we now call trolling, right? It's somebody who has never done what you're doing, but they're criticizing you anyway. And their criticism comes from a place of not knowing what in the F they're talking about. And in that case, their opinion literally means nothing. So a lot of times we see this coming from art critics. I hate to say it, some art critics out there are not artists. As a matter of fact, most of them are not. And they have no idea what it takes to go into creating new ways of doing things. Drew has received criticism for art critics for many, many years. He doesn't really get it so much anymore now that he's got 30 years behind him of proving that he's a true artist without the credentials that art critics want you to have. I'll give you another example of a recent example of criticism. And I'm using Drew as an example. I get a lot of criticism too, but Drew is the one who really puts himself out there. So last year, Drew died a couple times. He was in the hospital for almost 5 months, extremely ill, on a ventilator for 3 months, which, if you don't know what a ventilator is, it's that tube they stick down your throat. So he had a near-death experience, and he took almost a year to process it. And finally came out and publicly told his new near-death experience. And there's 2 videos on YouTube. One's a short one, and one's a very long one on a huge podcast called the Jeff Mara podcast, where he was interviewed by Jeff Mara about his near-death experience. Now, 95% of the 600 plus comments on that podcast on YouTube were positive. Thank you, Drew, for sharing your experience. Oh my gosh. You know, it was all positive. But there was about 5% of trolls on there. And I'm going to admit the trolls hurt my feelings, even though it's not me, it's my husband. But I know my husband. I know what he went through. I know how hard it was for him to come out and say this publicly, speak about this publicly. It was very difficult for him. I know that he's still processing the trauma and PTSD of nearly dying and being in the hospital for 5 months and coming home in a wheelchair, learning how to walk again. And some of the mean comments were, oh, he's trying to sound like Clint Eastwood, because Drew's voice, it actually does sound like Clint Eastwood now. Because he had a tube down his throat for 3 months, his voice is never going to sound the same. And it's cruel. These are cruel comments that people leave because they don't know what it's like to have a tube down their throat for 3 months. They have no idea how hard it is to go through something so traumatic and then find the guts to talk about it publicly. So that being said, like, a lot of criticism is just people not knowing what in the F they're talking about. And somehow we have to just ignore it and know that it comes from absolute ignorance and maybe a little cruelty, and who knows where else it's coming from. I do know this, that anyone that's putting something out into the world, whether it's sharing something very personal with the hopes of helping other people, which is what Drew did with his near-death experience, or it's showing the world a new way of creating art, making music, what have you, it takes a lot of guts. And it's to be applauded, even if it's not perfect, even if it's not 100% on point. I mean, sharing your stuff with the world is really important. And you have to take the criticism with a grain of salt if they don't know what they're talking about. And if they do know what they're talking about, you take the criticism as a way to do it better next time. So I hope this helped. Please leave me a comment. If you're listening on YouTube, please Hit subscribe wherever you're listening to this, and join my inner circle. In the show notes, there's a link. And if you want to send me a question, I will answer it on a future podcast. Thank you for being here with me. I hope this helps somebody out there. Love to you all. Bye-bye.